I'll ask one last time. Who are you? A poor father begging for favors, or someone hiding something in those kids' bags? The officer spat each word, his tone dripping with contempt. In the airport, amidst the calls for flights and the eyes of passing travelers, he humiliated an entire black family as if they were a threat. But just seconds later, when the father coldly opened his wallet and placed his FBI badge in front of him, no one dared to breathe too loudly. This is why you need to watch until the end, because public humiliation will be met with a silent punishment that can never be undone. The glass doors slid open, and the blast of cold air from the security checkpoint hit their faces like an invisible welcome ritual. The mother adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder, her eyes sweeping quickly over the long line of passengers preparing to take off their shoes and place their luggage on the conveyor belt. Her 4 daughters walked beside her, each wearing the same pink dress, a round-necked one-piece their mother had sewn herself before the trip. The oldest girl held the youngest's hand, whispering something that made them both giggle. The mother bent down and gently said, "We're about to board. You girls remember to stay quiet, okay? No playing around too much at the airport." Her voice wasn't stern, more like a soft reminder trying to protect their small excitement from being swept away by the chaos and unfamiliarity of a public space. This was their first family trip since the father's reassignment, and they had waited nearly 2 years for this day. The tension in the line was already thick, with constant announcements blaring from the speakers, but what made the air suddenly feel heavier was the look coming from the 3rd security desk. A white male officer in his 30s, tall, with a clipped tone and eyes full of suspicion, turned his gaze toward the family. His first words weren't a greeting or instructions. He smirked, looked straight through the children's bright pink clothes, then turned to a nearby colleague and muttered, half mocking, half commanding, "Cute uniforms. Let's see what's underneath." The words hit the corridor like a slap. No one said anything, but it was clear that a few people in line paused mid-motion. The mother gently squeezed the hand of the daughter closest to her. She didn't look directly at the officer, but her gaze no longer held its earlier softness. The children, once eager for vacation, now started glancing around, as if unsure whether they had done something wrong. The oldest girl instinctively tugged her dress lower. It wasn't shame, but a reflexive shield in response to a certain kind of look. The officer walked over, not rushing, not angry, but each step made it clear to the mother, this wasn't random screening. This was selection, a kind based on things not listed in a passport. He glanced over their luggage, then shifted tone, pretending to joke. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, full lineup. Planning a royal birthday party abroad? No one answered. A TSA agent 2 desks over started to move closer, but one slight tilt of the main officer's head sent him back to his post. The mother took a deep breath. Her fear didn't come from the possibility of being detained, but from what her children were learning in that moment, that in some places, skin color was still enough to spark suspicion. She opened her bag, pulled out the documents, and looked over at the remaining 3 daughters. "Stand close together. Don't let go of your sister's hand," she said quietly, not as an instruction, but to reassure them that she was still in control. The air seemed slow, like sound had been drained from the room, and in that silence, even the smallest gestures became loud. A furrowed brow, a glance that lingered too long, a tight-lipped smile that meant authority. The youngest looked up at her mother, then at the officer inspecting a suitcase nearby. Her eyes widened as she saw him use gloved hands to dig deep into another passenger's inner jacket pocket. "Mom, are they going to do that to us, too?" The question sliced through the thick air like a thread. The mother didn't answer. She bent down, wiped her daughter's hand and pulled the girls closer to her and ahead. The officer began to walk toward them. The gray rubber gloves were on, ready for what he called a procedure. The trip hadn't started, but their sky was already darkened by power using words to dominate, not protect. And the one question left wasn't in the luggage. It was in the children's eyes. If even their mother was doubted, was anywhere truly safe? A second officer stood nearby, tall, thin, arms crossed, eyes dull, as if none of this concerned him. His uniform was neat, his badge shining, but his gaze avoided the mother's every time she looked over, silently asking for help. He saw it all, the sneer, the way the children flinched. He even saw the young TSA agent step forward, then stop when the lead officer flicked a hand, wordlessly saying, "Stay back." The agent swallowed, turned away, and busied himself with the trays. A passenger glanced over, then moved on. Nothing stopped. Power didn't need to explain. The lead officer stepped to the counter. The mother handed over her ID and tickets, her voice calm, her hand shaking. Her eldest stood closer, holding her sister's wrist. He skimmed the documents, ignored the names, and stared at the faces, from the oldest to the youngest. Then came the jab. "You sure these are yours? Or bought in bulk?" It sounded like a joke, but it cut deeper. The mother didn't answer. She looked at her youngest, gripping her dress, small fingers learning how to hold on before they could understand why. "They're just kids," she said, voice rough. He looked straight at her. Kids hide knives better than adults. He said it like truth, like training, though it reeked of bias. Not a warning, not concerned, just cruelty. The second daughter, about 7, lowered her head. She didn't get the words, but she knew one thing. When grown-ups mentioned knives, it meant danger. The mother whispered something to her, then stood tall. In that moment, she wasn't just a mom on a trip, she was a shield, the last line. So her children wouldn't carry one more wound. No one objected, but everyone heard. A guard glanced over, then looked away. An older man pulled out his phone, not to call, but to record, quietly. The officer stepped closer. "We'll take a closer look. Random gut feeling doesn't matter," he said, mocking the rules. The mother didn't flinch. In her eyes was something he hadn't prepared for, not fear, but clarity. She'd lived too long being judged for others' assumptions. She was done asking to be seen as an exception. The youngest began to cry, but the mother didn't bend down. She took her hand and said, "We're still going," quiet, but loud enough. And for the first time he hesitated, as if that invisible power had just met a wall it couldn't name. Not made of documents, but of a mother who didn't back down. The officer scanned the group like picking prey, then pointed at the oldest girl. "Shoes off. Socks too." She froze, glanced at her mother. The mother nodded slightly, voice low but clear. "Do it, honey." The girl bent down, fumbling with the double-tied laces of her heavy shoes. They weren't slip-ons, but thick, travel-ready ones. Her movements were clumsy, the knot snagged, and she lost balance as one foot lifted. The mother reached down to catch her, both hands out, but in that moment the officer lunged and yanked her back like dragging a threat. Her back hit the floor with a dry thud that made nearby people flinch. Time slowed for a beat. No one expected a woman who had only held her kids, followed rules, and offered cooperation to be thrown down in plain sight by someone wearing a badge. A TSA agent raised a hand to step in, then froze when the second officer, still arms crossed, gave a warning look. The mother lay on her side, bruised arm pressed to her waist. Her 4 daughters closed in around her, a small circle drawn tight around a breaking point. No one cried aloud, but in their eyes was something no lesson could teach. They were witnessing a kind of power never shown in textbooks. No guns, no shouting, just silent force reshaping trust forever. In the crowd now gathering, a man pulled out his phone. He lifted it high enough, quietly enough, to frame the officer through the lens. The first thing recorded, a mother gripping her child's arm to stand, blood on her other hand. Her breath was sharp, not from anger but from holding in sound. She saw the camera but made no signal. She knew sometimes the only shield for truth was a third party not under control. The officer stepped back and barked, "Film again and you're getting cuffed." It wasn't a question or command. It was a claim over what could be seen. He didn't ask who was filming, didn't look, just said it like the image belonged to him. Some people hesitated, heads down, but the man kept filming, his hand steady, his eyes unshaken. The mother stood. Blood streaked her sleeve. Her eyes no longer avoided anyone. The oldest daughter had retrieved her shoes. hurriedly putting them back on, eyes down. She wasn't trembling, but something had shifted in her posture. There was no longer hesitation. It was defense, shaped by public humiliation. That imprint doesn't fade. A murmur rose behind them. Did he push her? Someone whispered. A middle-aged woman backed up with her baby, shielding its head. A young man slid off one earbud, glancing at the phone screen nearby. The tension wasn't just around one family anymore. It began reaching everyone, like a quiet warning. If it were them on the ground today, would anyone stop it? The officer turned to the growing crowd, his gaze sharper. "Disperse! If you've got no reason to be here, get back in line." But no one moved. A few stayed silent, holding their place. The silence wasn't obedience, it was watching, waiting to see how far this would go. And in that moment, something reached a limit even he couldn't see. No amount of authority could control every lens quietly pointed at him. The youngest girl was just 4. Since being told to stand in line, she had clung to her mother's dress, wide eyes fixed on the man in uniform. She didn't know why her mother was pushed, or why her sister had to remove her shoes in front of strangers, but she knew this. Her mother's hand was getting cold, and her sister's eyes didn't look the same anymore. When the officer approached and crouched to her eye level, the girl screamed. Not a tantrum, but a survival cry. Sharp and instinctive, from a body too small to understand, but too alert not to fear. The officer's face didn't change. He leaned in and gently tugged the pink cat-shaped bag on her shoulder. Her mother reached out, but too late to stop him. He unzipped it, digging through each pocket like something urgent was hidden inside. Out fell crayons, a small comb, and a broken cookie. Nothing dangerous, nothing that could justify a search. But he kept going, hand methodical and cold. The mother's eyes stayed locked on every motion, not from fear of what he might find, but to keep her other daughters from breaking down. She said nothing, knowing even the right reaction could be twisted into non-compliance. Her focus was now singular, get her kids out whole. The little one was still crying, fingers clenching her mother's dress hard enough to leave red marks. Her breath hitched with each rummage of the man's gloved hand. He pulled out the last crayon, looked at it, and dropped it onto the table. His face stayed blank. There was nothing suspicious, no reason to keep them, no sign of threat, only that they didn't look like the quiet majority passing through. He stood, adjusted his gloves, then said, loud enough for all to hear, "I don't need a reason to search. I just need a feeling." The words landed like a blunt blade, dull but heavy enough to rip the last strands of trust. They weren't meant for the child, but they etched deep into the family's memory. The mother didn't reply. Her gaze no longer trembled. She didn't fight, but she didn't lower her eyes either. It was the look of someone pushed to the edge of silence, where there's no room left to yield. A look beyond words, but impossible to dismiss. A man in line behind them clicked his tongue quietly. No one answered the officer. No one protested. But the air no longer felt like surrender. It was holding its breath, waiting, as if everyone now knew something had crossed a line, not just through action, but through the words spoken aloud. The mother pulled her daughter close, wiping her tears with a sleeve, then looked up at the officer again. No questions, no anger, just the quiet defiance of a mother long used to being watched, but never ready to let her children learn the wrong lesson in a place meant to be safe. The children didn't understand it all, but they would remember. Not the exact words, but the feeling of being treated like a threat. And in that memory, a question would grow. Why must some prove they are harmless, while those who hurt them never have to prove anything at all? He entered the screening area with a tall frame, broad shoulders, and firm, deliberate steps. A fitted yellow t-shirt hugged his solid build. Dark pants and tactical shoes made him stand out from the crowd, quietly shuffling forward, heads bowed to procedure. His eyes didn't dart around. He didn't rush, didn't scan. His gaze, cold like metal, fixed straight ahead, where he had already spotted the familiar backs of the people he came for. The woman in line, with dried blood on her right arm and long, twisted hair covering her left cheek, was leaning over to shield a small child. The eldest girl's head was down, but her hand gripped her sister's wrist tightly. None of them looked his way, and he didn't move faster, didn't call out, didn't show recognition. There was just enough distance between him and the anger now rising in his chest. He saw everything, the conveyors still spinning, trays moving in rhythm, inspection lights steady, everything working as expected, except for a family being turned into a target without question. The second officer, silent until now like a stone lodged in a current, stepped in front of him. No questions, no suspicion, just a scan from head to toe, then a raised brow and a single line, "Got ID?" The man didn't stop completely, but his eyes moved, first to the glint of the badge on the officer's chest, then to the wrinkles near his eyes, and finally to the hand resting loose near the holstered weapon. A heavy silence followed, longer than necessary. "No ID, you go another way." The officer's voice came out like muscle memory, not thought. The way he said "you" wasn't conversational. It was a command, a pattern repeated until it became habit, a reflex of power when it meets someone it doesn't want to validate. But the man gave no reply. No frown, no reaction. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to hear what was happening beyond, his child's sniffles, his wife's short breaths, and the lead officer's voice ordering the suitcase searched again. He stood there, gaze cold as frost but feet planted. People nearby started to notice. A strong man, not aggressive, but carrying a quiet authority that made the airport seem to pause. He wasn't the kind to back down, and he wasn't the kind to escalate, but clearly he wasn't someone to be handled easily. The second officer began to feel his fingers tighten, that familiar urge to assert control rising. And yet, there was no reason to threaten the man in front of him. He had done nothing. He was just standing. An airport staffer walked past and caught sight of the standoff. He paused briefly, but the officer glanced his way, then turned back to face the man. No one said anything more. The air thickened. What seemed like it would end with a dismissal had turned into a strange stalemate, uniformed power on one side and a steady, unshaken presence on the other. The man placed 3 fingers on his pocket where he kept his wallet, but didn't pull it out. He wasn't in a hurry, and he didn't need to prove anything. What he held was something the officer couldn't measure with procedure. The officer squinted, feeling control slipping. Behind him, the mother looked up, her eyes fixed on the man she hadn't yet called by name. Without a word, it was clear the story had shifted, and power had cracked because of someone who hadn't said a single thing. Malcolm stood with both arms at his sides, calm and still, but his eyes had moved past the officer blocking him and locked onto his family. Through the crowd, he saw his eldest daughter shrinking behind her mother. One foot was lifted slightly from pain, her hand still wrapped around her younger sister's wrist. Her eyes were down, as if trying to disappear. Small, clenched fingers, damp with sweat. Her cheek trembling, lips pressed so tight a pale ring formed around her mouth. Malcolm didn't move, but his gaze cut through the scene, instinctively taking in the harm others tried to ignore. In a space usually filled with flight announcements and suitcase wheels, this scene stood out, not for skin color or matching clothes, but for the pressure suffocating the children. A weight they didn't understand, but felt pressing down. Malcolm took a breath, but stayed still. He knew this was an unchosen stage, where every move, however small, could be twisted into cause to detain, to accuse, to erase legitimacy. Suddenly, a voice tore through the silence like a blade. "Who do you think you are, protecting them?" the lead officer barked, loud enough to make the whole line turn. It wasn't about policy, it was a claim of ownership, as if the mother had crossed a line she wasn't allowed to. She stayed in place, holding her daughter close, not retreating, not resisting. No words were needed. Her stance made it clear to all. This was no longer routine screening. This was humiliation. The officer's voice came again, but a soft sound drowned out part of it, the live stream playing from a phone held by a young man near the metal detector. The app showed hundreds watching live, comments rolling in non-stop. The feed had started from afar, but when the officer shouted, the camera zoomed in. capturing his face as he drew closer to the mother. Malcolm saw it all. The officer's clenched jaw, eyes red, wrist tightening. The mother held her ground while her 4 daughters shrank into a trembling mass. He saw the girl filming too, not afraid, not surprised, but as if she had seen this too many times. She just raised her phone, as if telling the world, this time won't stay buried. Malcolm still hadn't drawn his wallet or badge, but every second he stood there in silence was a declaration. He was present and he was watching, not to observe, but to remember. Because sometimes words aren't needed. Just being there long enough forces those who think they're invisible to face being seen. He knew too well the excuse called reasonable suspicion, and how often it started with skin and ended in blood on tile. The officer turned and saw Malcolm's eyes locked on the scene, unmoving, and for a second his arrogance faltered. Not because of anything Malcolm did, but because he couldn't read him, didn't know who he was, where he came from, or why he stood there so steady, and that, being unreadable, was what unsettled a man used to control. Without stepping forward, without saying a word, Malcolm had already started to shake the balance of a system too long shielded by silence. Blood from the mother's elbow trailed into a thin streak, staining the hem of the youngest girl's dress as she clung close. The mother didn't notice, or didn't have time to. The shock from the fall still spun in her head, but what weighed heavier was the look in her children's eyes. Confused, scared, helpless, all asking the same thing. Can you still stand? A TSA agent, a young woman with a name tag slightly tilted on her chest, stepped forward, reaching out, but the lead officer gave a sharp tilt of his head, eyes narrowing in warning. The agent hesitated, then quietly withdrew her hand. The mother pushed herself up with one hand, still holding her daughter's wrist with the other. The girl whimpered again, not from pain, but from not understanding why standing beside her mother could be a reason to be shamed. No one around moved. Even those watching the live stream now held their phones still, eyes shifting to the man walking toward the woman on the floor. He didn't push through, didn't speak, but the space around him opened on its own, as if everyone understood this moment belonged to him. Malcolm approached steadily. He crouched, reaching between the daughters clinging to their mother. His movements weren't rushed, but they brought everything to a pause. He touched his wife's arm with both steady hands, gently lifting her elbow as if handling something fragile. She didn't speak, didn't cry, but her eyes softened, not from comfort, but because someone had arrived not to question her, but to see her the way she deserved to be seen. "Does it hurt?" Malcolm asked softly, just loud enough for her. A simple question, but it made her freeze. Until now, every word had been about papers, travel plans, and matching clothes, but now someone noticed the pain, not to judge, but to ask how she might stand again. He supported her shoulder, helped her to her feet, and brushed dust from her dress. No hollow reassurances, no apology for what had been done, just presence, solid, timely, and whole, enough for her to know not everyone in a different uniform stood on the other side. The girls began to breathe easier, seeing their mother upright. The oldest reached for her hand, about to ask something, then stopped. Malcolm glanced at the wound, then looked up at the officer. His eyes held no loud anger, but enough weight to force the officer to look away. There was something in Malcolm's presence, no name, no title, yet it shifted the balance. He wasn't shouting, but one thing was clear. From the moment he arrived, indifference was no longer an option. The air at the checkpoint thickened, not because anyone raised their voice, but because a man had stepped into the space where dignity had been stripped and placed it back where it belonged, and no one stopped him. A father, a husband, a man who needed no permission to do what was right. In the stillness, the crowd kept watching, as if they all realized what mattered most wasn't the blood on the mother's arm, but the way her husband walked in, not to speak for the system, but to stand beside her, so it could no longer ignore her. The lead officer straightened and stepped forward slowly, as if preparing for a confrontation he was sure he would win. He stopped in front of Malcolm, chin slightly raised, eyes narrowed, voice tight. "I'll ask one more time. Who are you?" It wasn't a request for identification. It was a threat, aimed at the presence of a man who didn't belong to the world this officer believed he controlled. The silence deepened. That question echoed not only in Malcolm's ears, but in the awareness of everyone nearby. Ravelers, airport staff, and those still holding up their phones. It struck like a final blow to a trust already cracked, revealing the truth. Power here didn't come from protocol or position, but from a practiced contempt for others. Malcolm stayed still, one hand resting lightly on his wife's shoulder, eyes steady. He didn't step back or forward, just held his ground like a shield between his family and the man in uniform. No words. No gesture of identity. In Malcolm's eyes, the question didn't deserve an answer, not because it wasn't clear, but because it wasn't asked in good faith. It was a challenge to his right to exist, and that, to him, was not up for debate. A middle-aged man near the screening post lowered his phone. His face showed shock, but he didn't look away. He had just finished a 1-minute live stream, enough to capture the woman being shoved, the crying child, and the officer shouting as if scolding a thief. No edits. He hit share. A simple caption appeared on screen. Black family humiliated at airport checkpoint for dressing alike. Within seconds, the clip began to spread. Another person nearby unlocked their phone, tapped the screen, eyes widening as the video rapidly gained views. A group of young passengers leaned over to watch, whispering in disbelief and anger. What had been contained within a few feet now moved beyond the checkpoint, across wireless signals, into every connected screen in the terminal, and from there, into the world. Malcolm knew he had become the center of attention without asking for it, but he also knew silence, held at the right moment, could carry more weight than any credentials. When facing contempt, you don't always need an argument, just the refusal to step back. He didn't answer the officer's question, but the way he stood, unflinching, eyes forward, no retreat, made the man who shouted falter without realizing it. The officer glanced at the group now staring into their phones. He didn't yet know how far the video had traveled, but he understood something had changed. He was no longer the only one defining the moment. Someone else outside this checkpoint was beginning to see what had just happened. And for the first time, control slipped from his hands without anyone needing to take it. A female TSA agent looked at Malcolm, then at the officer. No one spoke, but it was clear. The line between procedure and abuse had just been exposed in plain view. The father, the mother, the children, they were no longer surrounded by suspicion. They were being witnessed, and that simple shift had begun to fracture the tone of command the man in the badge had always relied on. The officer zipped up the last bag and pushed it toward the family with the back of his gloved hand. He straightened, head down like reading from a charge sheet, then looked up and tore through the tight silence with his voice. "Nothing there, but your faces are suspicious enough." It wasn't an update or an explanation. It was a cold, closing statement, wrapped in the authority he believed allowed him to treat a look like a crime. The mother bent down to repack her children's things. Her hands moved from habit, but her eyes no longer matched the motions. She didn't turn, didn't respond, but when she looked up, something had shifted. No more hesitation, no more fear of being detained, only a quiet sharpness. The gaze of someone wounded by the very system meant to protect her. It carried no rage, no tears, just clarity deep enough to show how far the insult had sunk. Malcolm placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, watching each child adjust their bags and smooth their clothes as if trying to shake off what had just happened. No one spoke, but the shift showed in every movement. The eldest walked slower, eyes no longer fixed on the floor but scanning the faces around her, not with blame, but with intent, to remember who turned away, who stood nearby and did nothing, and who saw everything but stayed silent, as if the truth needed no witness. The family was allowed to leave. The officer offered no parting word, no note, just stepped back with hands on hips, eyes still locked on them as if they might turn dangerous again at any second. The hostility wasn't in what he said, but in the way he stood, openly contemptuous, even after being proven wrong. An airport worker pulled the barrier aside. People in line began to move forward, but the usual noise of a crowded day was missing. Everyone felt something had just happened, something they couldn't brush off as a minor scene. A woman holding her phone tapped save. She didn't share the video yet, but her eyes followed the family as they walked away. The mother walked with a slight lean, her injured arm pulling her off balance. Each step echoed in the long corridor, as if silence itself had stepped aside to let the sound speak. Malcolm walked last, his gaze steady behind them. He didn't assert power, didn't deliver warnings. His silence did the work. The man who humiliated his family wasn't arrested, wasn't shouted down, but had lost something more valuable, the trust of those who had seen. The youngest girl tugged her mother's hand, asked something in a small voice, but no answer came. The mother only looked down at her child, then ahead, toward the gate where the light was beginning to show. One step out of the dark, but nothing left behind. What happened clung to every glance, every motion, as if their bodies had already begun adapting to survive something they never chose. None of the family looked back, not because they wanted to forget, but because they had remembered enough. The words, the silence, the details, all of it had settled into memory, a kind of evidence not written on paper, but lasting in truth, that even without doing anything wrong, a black family could still be treated as suspicious, simply for showing up too exactly in the wrong place at the wrong time. The oldest daughter slowed, turned to make sure her father was still behind them. Under the cold white airport lights, he stood out, not by height or clothing, but by the way he moved. Steady, quiet, controlled. She paused when he drew close, then looked up, her voice barely a breath. "What did we do wrong, Dad?" Malcolm didn't stop. He met her eyes, placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and nudged her forward. No words came, not because he had no answer, but because any answer now would teach her something he wasn't ready to accept, that in some places, people don't need a reason to hurt a family. The question didn't fade. It lingered like a dull ache no medicine could touch. But her father's gaze, steady, protective and heavy, told her she had just crossed into a kind of growing up no child should reach so soon. The family turned into a small waiting area near the gate. The mother sat on a bench, carefully wrapping her wound with a bandage a late-arriving medic had brought. The kids drank water, shared a few candies, and tried to hold on to some leftover joy. But no one smiled. No one asked when the flight would take off. Malcolm whispered something to his wife, then stood and walked toward the men's restroom. He didn't need company. He didn't need a break. Inside the tiled room filled with soap scent and fan noise, he picked the last stall, locked it, and leaned against the wall. He checked his phone, swiping past a stream of alerts from social platforms. A video link sat pinned to the top of his feed, tagged "Gate Check Racism," with more than 10,000 shares in under an hour. He tapped play. The first frame showed the officer pushing his wife to the ground, their youngest screaming. Another angle cut their oldest wobbling out of her shoes, barefoot, foot hitting the floor. He swiped to the next clip, the officer yelling in his wife's face, almost pressing into her body as she held a child. The words were clear, each one sharp. Behind them, the kids' faces, no one crying out loud, but the fear showed in their clasped hands. Another clip, shot from the left, showed Malcolm himself walking in, his eyes cutting through the air. He saw the moment he didn't answer when asked who he was, saw the silence making waves in the comments. Who is that, father? Who has eyes like that and says nothing? This isn't the first time we've seen this. But this time, someone hit record. Malcolm lowered the phone, closed his eyes for one brief second. He didn't feel rage. He didn't feel vindicated. What came to mind was his daughter's small shoulders when she asked, "What did we do wrong?" And because of that question, he knew silence wasn't enough. He couldn't disappear into the role of the victim. He didn't need recognition. He just needed to make sure the system that made his children shake would no longer growl unchecked without being recorded. His phone buzzed. A colleague texted, "I saw the clip. Don't talk to the press. But if you need legal backup, I've got you." Malcolm didn't reply right away. He saved the message, then reopened the video. This time, he didn't look at the officer who shoved his wife. He looked into the eyes of his children, those he tried to keep safe, now carrying a lesson no father wants to teach. And from that moment, He knew the only thing left was to see it through, not with shouting, but with steps marked by evidence, memory, and a truth they could no longer deny. In less than 5 hours since the video was uploaded, views had surpassed 2 million. On screens across devices, the scene of a police officer shoving a mother, yelling into her face, then searching a little girl's bag like confronting a dangerous suspect, replayed with every swipe. No color filters, no music. The clip held power not because it invented a new story, but because it exposed an old one. Hundreds of thousands of comments poured in, the top pinned one asking a single question: if they were white, would this have happened? The question didn't seek one answer. It opened up a flood of responses. Some tried to explain with protocol, security standards, and cooperation, but the stronger, louder current came from people who had lived through being profiled for not wearing the majority's face. I got stopped at an airport for wearing a hoodie. I was 13 with my mom. Another wrote, one time I had to take off my wig to prove nothing was hidden. No one said sorry. Among them, a comment from an anonymous account drew major attention. He forced me to give him my number at a soccer field. I was 16. No profile photo, no bio, but within 2 hours, it had over 5,000 likes and hundreds of replies. One asked, did he have the same name as the cop in the video? Another answered, I remember those eyes. He grabbed my shirt at a convenience store. I was buying milk. Memories long buried began to surface like water from a cracked pipe. Not because people had never wanted to speak, but because there'd never been a moment when speaking didn't risk being twisted. This video, spreading like wildfire, had become living proof, making even the smallest voices harder to dismiss as exaggeration. And for the first time, those who endured felt that if they didn't speak now, they'd be pushed back into the old state, where silence was praised as being polite. A freelance journalist posted a short article listing 12 prior incidents linked to the officer in the clip, pulled from civil complaints and old reports, scrubbed from government pages. Some were marked handled internally, others insufficient bases for further inquiry. But the pattern was clear. Most of the people targeted were black teenagers, lone women, or those showing fear before being stopped. The story reached local media. They didn't name the officer, but referenced the airport incident, calling it a screening that crossed the line. Meanwhile, a Southern civil rights group issued an official statement calling for an independent investigation free from internal influence. The message was reshared tens of thousands of times, not because it was new, but because this time it had something to stick to: the video, still multiplying across platforms, now appearing in group chats, student posts, and even a high school radio bulletin more than 500 miles away. Malcolm read the comments with quiet eyes. He didn't reply, didn't share, but he knew each short post was a piece of a much larger map, one where his family was just a bright red dot in a long chain of forgotten or buried incidents. He didn't need a microphone to speak, because clearly those once seen as isolated were forming a collective, not organized, not loud, but strong enough to make the world turn its head. And he understood that, from this moment on, it was no longer just about his family. It was a test for an entire community to see if truth, shared at the right time, could crack a system built on silence. That afternoon, the hashtag #GateCheckRacism surged to the top of every trending chart. Social media users flooded timelines with the clip showing the officer shoving a black mother, searching a crying child's bag, and mocking the reason for it all as a feeling. A verified account led the wave, posting, if they had been white, would anyone dare yank a 4-year-old's bag and ask if she was hiding a knife? Below each video were thousands of comments, ranging from outrage to eerily similar stories. He did the same to my sister at the East Side gas station. I remember him, made me show my belt because I looked off. He showed up in a lawsuit once, but the file disappeared. One admission hit harder than the rest, like a crack breaking through the last layer of denial. He forced me to give my number at the park soccer field. I was 16. No one believed me. At the same time, major news outlets began analyzing every detail of the uniform, matching badges, zooming into frames to trace his identity. The local police department initially declined comment, offering only a vague statement that security procedures are under review. But the evasion only added fuel to the fire, growing by the hour. Mainstream outlets, once cautious, started asking openly, who is this officer? What departments has he served in? Why is he reassigned every time a complaint is filed? Malcolm didn't answer any calls from reporters. He posted nothing, didn't share the clip, and remained silent in community forums. But inside his home office, every action carried the weight of quiet momentum. He downloaded high-quality footage from 3 sources, selected the clearest frame of the officer's face, adjusted the colors, and printed a large copy. No captions, no frame. The photo went in the center of the corkboard on the gray wall around it, blank sheets of paper. But Malcolm already knew what he'd write on them in the days ahead. This wasn't the act of a father seeking revenge. It was the reflex of someone trained to observe systems and track the missing links. He wasn't angry like he had been when catching his wife mid-fall, nor stunned like when his daughter asked, "What did we do wrong?" What remained now was a nearly emotionless focus, what his old colleagues once called cold case mode. He pulled a chair, opened a worn folder from his safe, cases that never made it to court for lack of evidence, names buried in redacted reports. On his screen, he began typing name after name. Girls who vanished after baseless stops. Young men labeled non-compliant, with no witnesses. Among them, 3 lived just blocks from the airport, all 3 randomly checked by the same officer. No one spoke to Malcolm now. The small house had gone quiet, his daughters fast asleep, his wife curled on the couch, clutching a pillow like she still feared being back in the terminal. But in the office, the light stayed on. Beneath the printed photo of the officer, Malcolm picked up a pen and wrote the first line on a blank sheet. Case 1. 16 years old, East Side Park. Then he pinned it, starting to redraw the silent map of a system that had let one man's footprints go unchecked for too long. Malcolm had spent 15 years in the federal force, yet in the modest suburban home he now lived in, he had never used his badge to prove anything. Not even after the airport incident. To him, the title agent was never something to flaunt, but a tool. And that tool only held real value when paired with silence, precision, and a refusal to draw a weapon before understanding the nature of the target. In the days following the airport check, he didn't reach out to any former colleagues or use official systems to look up personal data on the officers. He chose a slower route, but one that was cleaner. He began by combing through complaints that had been withdrawn over the past 4 years in the city. Some had been removed from the system, but he had a way to trace them through the public archive portal, where original documents occasionally remained, quoted in edited versions. One of those files made him pause longer than usual. A suicide case from 3 years ago. A 20-year-old girl. Her name was Alea Monroe. She had died in the spring, in a small room near the Southern train station. The death certificate read simply, self-inflicted, no signs of force, no suicide note. But when Malcolm followed comments on a memorial post, recently reshared, he found an anonymous account that mentioned a notebook retained during the autopsy, and never returned to the family. Malcolm went to the old county courthouse where the case had been handled. There, through a records clerk who had once been a classmate, he borrowed a copy of unofficial notes. Alea's journal, thin and nearly torn apart, had been deemed unrelated to the cause of death. But just one entry made Malcolm sit in silence for minutes. He always shows up behind me. Always smiling, but that smile makes my skin crawl. I once thought about screaming, but Mom said, "He's a cop. Maybe you misunderstood. Tomorrow I'll write more. If I can't, maybe he saw me again." No specific names were mentioned, but from the timeline and location described, Malcolm cross-checked officerships in the area. One name appeared in all 4 instances. Alea had reported a uniformed man approaching for no reason, and that name belonged to the man now at the center of a video that had surpassed 10 million views. Malcolm didn't need emotional confirmation. He only needed to connect the dots, one cold fact at a time. A young woman, harassed, not believed, then gone. a mother beside her choosing silence because she believed cops must be right, and a system that automatically filed such descriptions under unstable mental state. He wrote Alea's name on the board in his room. Beneath the officer's photo, he scrawled one line in a shaky but aligned hand: Alea Monroe, spring, 20 years old. He didn't know if her family still lived in the city, but one thing he knew for certain: they had never been told about that entry in the journal. And the system hadn't made a clerical error. It had simply refused to keep what it chose not to believe. That night, he retaped the officer's photo, adjusting the light so the reflection hit the man's eyes. He stared at it like a silent test, not for the man in the picture, but for himself. How many cases had he brushed past during major investigations because they were unrelated to the main objective? How many times had he filed uncertain matters under unnecessary because of time constraints? Now, everything was clearer than ever, and this time, he didn't need power to act, only patience, and a notebook, still bearing the imprint of a hand that once tried to speak before the world was ready to listen. They never expected anyone to stand with them. When their daughter's words were dismissed, the family had nearly closed the door forever on the hope that someone in the system would listen. The father, a middle-aged man with graying hair, held tight to a childhood photo of his daughter beside the memorial frame, while the mother said plainly, "We didn't think anyone would believe." Each word she spoke carried the weight of years of silence they had been forced to swallow. Everyone in the room sat quietly, no one interrupting, because the pain within those walls needed no further explanation. Malcolm didn't interfere with their emotions. He simply placed the recorder on the table, nodded slowly, and opened his notebook. On the page were a series of timestamps, records of the times the girl had reported to her school, had sent emails to the district authorities, and had tried to mail anonymous letters about the suspicious behavior of a police officer seen near the dormitory area. Malcolm traced each line, as if following a wrinkled old map, hoping to recover something long forgotten. As night fell, he returned home and sifted through materials that had once circulated within internal systems. Among hundreds of emails marked "No response needed," he found a name matching the complaint filed by the victim's family. The content of the email was brief, a report from a TSA staff member noting the officer's excessively familiar behavior toward a young female passenger. But what mattered more than the content was the automated reply from a superior: insufficient evidence to proceed with further investigation. Malcolm printed the email and pinned it to the already crowded board, underlining a line in red ink: "Who answered this email?" He stared at that robotic sentence, as if it had ended a life without ever pulling a trigger. No gunshot, no visible wound, but the result was still a funeral, and a family that would never be whole again. The next day, he tracked down the person who had written the report. It was a TSA officer who had since transferred, now working at a small airport in the South. The man seemed surprised that someone was digging up an old story. "I used to think I did the right thing," he said, "but after being ignored, I started to wonder if maybe I was wrong." Malcolm didn't respond right away, because he understood that feeling, the weight of being pushed aside by the very system you served, simply for trying to do the right thing. Back in his office, Malcolm sat and looked at the board that was now nearly full. Every note was a piece of the puzzle, but the most important piece was silence. The silence from superiors, from those who had seen but turned away, and from victims themselves when they began to lose faith that their voices still mattered. And that silence was what made this no longer an isolated incident, but a symptom of systemic helplessness. He wrote one final line in his notebook: "When silence becomes complicity, justice never stands a chance." And under the soft glow of the room's light, Malcolm set aside his emotions, because he knew from that moment on what he was doing was no longer for the sake of the FBI. It was to ensure that those who died in silence would not be forgotten again. He wasn't surprised by the comment, but it still took him a few seconds to push aside the frustration tingling behind his forehead. In a closed-door meeting between interagency investigative units, when Malcolm voluntarily brought up the officer who had stopped his family at the airport, a mid-ranking officer glanced around and then lowered his voice to a near whisper. He's got someone backing him. The sentence sounded like a gentle warning, but carried immense weight, as if cautioning someone about to step into an unspoken, forbidden zone that everyone understood, but no one dared put into writing. Malcolm didn't respond. He didn't need to ask who or why anymore. Experience had taught him that when someone needed protection, there was always something being hidden. He left the meeting with no new allies, but he didn't need them. On the drive back, while stopped at an intersection, Malcolm unlocked his phone and sent a 6-word message to the only contact he trusted outside the system. Need to meet. You should see this. The recipient was Adrian Keller, an old friend who had worked with Malcolm on multiple federal investigations and was now holding a position at the Department of Justice. They hadn't kept in touch for years, but the one thing that had never changed was that both acted based on what was right, not who stood behind them. Their meeting took place at the end of that day, in a small cafe nestled between federal buildings. Malcolm didn't bring printed documents or a hard drive. He carried only an encrypted laptop and a file folder containing copies of allegations, ignored emails, and the journal of the young woman who had taken her own life. Adrian opened the folder and silently read through every page. His expression remained mostly unchanged, but Malcolm knew the signs. The difference between someone processing information and someone suppressing anger. When Adrian looked up, his eyes had shifted. "You're sure about the victim's identity in the airport incident?" "My family," Malcolm answered plainly. The reply made Adrian pause, as if suddenly understanding another layer of why Malcolm had pursued the case with near-obsessive persistence. "Maybe I can't launch an official investigation just yet, but I can do something else." Adrian closed the folder, pulled out his phone, and turned toward the far wall, away from nearby tables. He spoke a rapid string of security commands before transferring the data into the Department of Justice's internal network. Malcolm, he understood the unspoken code shared by those who had worked deep within the system. Know enough, stay quiet at the right moments, and act only when every piece fits. They ended the conversation and said goodbye without another word. But Malcolm knew that from that moment forward, the truth had a chance to exist beyond the information board in his home office. What he needed now was time and precision. Returning home, he found his wife talking with their children about an upcoming trip. The vacation that had been canceled due to the airport incident would now be replaced by a new journey, this time by road. But Malcolm wasn't going. He sat at the table, opened his laptop, and reviewed every public accusation posted in the past week. The total had surpassed 100 entries. Many were anonymous, a few carried real names, and some were from people within the system. But all of them were talking about the same man, a man who once allowed himself to search children based on a feeling and a system that was once considered normal. Malcolm pinned another photo to the board. This time it was the cover of an old suicide case file, signed by an officer who had recommended the case be closed due to lack of grounds. He crossed out that note in red ink and circled the most recent date, the day when the truth was no longer just a claim. The leak surfaced one early morning in a post from a security forum once seen as an unofficial internal channel of the profession. A PDF file, over 30 pages long, without a title, without a signature, contained only brief notes, dates, and witness statements. 7 cases were listed. 7 separate times that officer had been reported for excessive force, discrimination, or unauthorized searches. The victims included students, the elderly, the disabled, and a pregnant woman in her 8th month. None of the cases were escalated to a formal investigation. All had ended with the same faint internal software remark: insufficient grounds for further verification. The post spread rapidly, with no one taking responsibility. But someone had saved the full data set, and independent newspapers began referencing the number 7 as a name in itself. Officer 7, one headline proclaimed. A podcast series launched a dedicated segment titled The 7 Left Behind, retelling the stories buried under a culture that had grown numb to violating people's rights. Yet while debates erupted across media and social networks, the man in question still showed up every morning at the airport, neatly armored, strutting like nothing had changed. He still patrolled the checkpoints, still scanned every group of people of color, uttered cold phrases when no one had the authority to stop him. But this time, he was no longer alone. A rising TikTok account with a security helmet as its avatar began tracking his every move. Each video, only 15 to 30 seconds long, carried no narration, no music, only footage. Him staring at mothers with children, pointing toward groups of young people, walking past the elderly with a look of contempt. Each short clip bore the same hashtag: keep watching, keep recording. At first, he glanced around but saw nothing. Passengers stared at him more than before, some gripping their phones, ready to record any suspicious move. He began to show signs of unease, muttering curses when he noticed someone trailing him at just enough distance to avoid being accused of interference, but he couldn't stop them. One morning, he turned abruptly in the long hallway connecting two screening zones. A girl in a gray hoodie was live streaming, her face half covered by a mask, giving only a faint smile when he looked into the camera. No words, no excess gestures. She simply kept following him, staying within legal distance, breaking no rules, just watching. Malcolm knew about those videos. He hadn't started them, but he had saved every one to his private drive. The more clips appeared, the more he saw one thing. Society was no longer sitting still. Small actions, every quiet recording, every whispered sentence into a lens, were forming something he had once doubted could grow so quickly, a network of witnesses. In his office, he pinned a new printout, 7 quotes from various complaints, each one a statement left unanswered. He marked a large question above one line. He said, "I like checking you people," and laughed. Beneath that, he wrote by hand, "Still laughing today." The story was no longer just about his family. It had moved beyond the pain of a mother shoved to the ground, beyond the choked stares of 4 girls in pink dresses. Now, every move made by the once protected man was under the lens of thousands, and this time he would have to learn how to patrol under the shadow of justice. The person behind his veil of power was not revealed through a press conference or official statement, but through a stream of leaked data from within the Western Regional Security Agency. His name appeared in a periodic personnel review from 7 years ago, where handwritten notes from the head of human resources hinted at an unofficial connection between the officer and a former classmate from training. Intimate meetings, photos taken at golf courses, and brief yet suggestive email exchanges began circulating, shared by insiders who had screenshotted and passed them to the outside. No document explicitly confirmed the power relationship, but the cover-up revealed itself in how complaints were postponed, evaluations were transferred to another department, and reports disappeared in transition. Meanwhile, a different figure emerged amid the wave of outrage. A former female officer who had worked in the same area with him 5 years ago sent an open letter to an independent human rights organization. In the letter, she described the exact incident that led to her reassignment. "I saw him corner a young girl in the staff parking lot. I reported it. 2 weeks later, I was reassigned to another area, no reason, no paperwork." Her words weren't aimed at vindicating herself or reclaiming her role, but simply to affirm that what was once dismissed as rumor had occurred. Malcolm received a copy of the letter not through law enforcement channels, but from a young law student interning at the organization. The student wrote in the email, "I don't know if this helps, but it seems like someone's starting to speak." Malcolm opened the file, read each line, then printed it and placed it beside the growing collage of evidence covering the left wall of his workspace. A few days later, the woman from the letter appeared on live television in a direct interview. Her face showed exhaustion, but each word she spoke was steady. When asked whether she feared retaliation for coming forward, she replied, "I've been scared for too long, so scared that silence became a reflex. Now, I want my daughter to know if anything happens, her mother has spoken clearly and fully." The interview drew millions of views within 2 days, and a new hashtag began to appear alongside GateCheck Racism. She essayed it first. Excerpts from her statement were reposted across platforms, placed among hundreds of stills from airport surveillance footage. Online communities pinpointed the exact timing of her reassignment, identifying irregularities in the internal personnel handling process of the local security department. The pressure increased not only on the officer, but also on the man who once shielded him. The independent inspector general of the Department of Justice was eventually forced to respond, confirming an active review into possible collusion between local leadership and law enforcement personnel. While the statement was technical, it marked the first time a federal agency had stepped into what had appeared to be a local matter, all thanks to fragmented data linked together by countless ordinary people. To Malcolm, this was confirmation that the path he had chosen, avoiding personal power plays and dramatic action, was beginning to yield results. He wasn't the only one connecting the dots, and didn't need to pull anyone to his side. The truth, if made clear enough, would reveal itself when someone stepped forward to echo it. And this time, a woman, once pushed out of the force, had stepped back into the light, not for revenge, but to restore something erased from official records: the first warning. The document she sent carried no name, no signature, and asked for no compensation. It included only one brief but weighty paragraph. "I do not request disciplinary action, nor seek punishment. I only request a full review of the internal handling process over the past 3 years, especially concerning files labeled not eligible for investigation." The letter was delivered to the Federal Oversight Office for Transparency in Law Enforcement, a body known for its slow replies but vested with the authority to initiate independent probes without needing local approval. 3 days later, an encrypted internal message confirmed that a special summons had been issued, based on supplemental evidence tied to human rights violations during passenger screenings in public areas. While the media still debated the whistleblower's identity, an unmarked convoy arrived at the police station where the officer worked. He was called outside without notice, right in the middle of chatting with colleagues about security plans for an upcoming fair. His first reaction was not fear, but a mix of anger and confusion. When he read the warrant clearly, he slammed his hand on the table and shouted across the lobby, "You think this is justice? I've kept order in this damn city for how long, and now you're cuffing me over some stupid videos?" A few colleagues looked like they were about to intervene, but the stare from the lead investigator made them free. He was escorted away, the sound of his boots hitting the tiled floor echoing dry and sharp amid the heavy silence of those around him. As he stepped outside the station, he tried one last time to threaten the duty manager, saying, "If you let them throw me in jail for this, we'll take the whole system down with us." But that kind of threat no longer carried the weight it once did. The moment the handcuffs locked around his wrists, what stirred the crowd wasn't just seeing a cop arrested. It was the fact that for the first time, inside the headquarters itself, a place that had long shielded, protected, and at times enabled, was now watching its system forced to amputate what had rotted. Across the city, Malcolm sat in his office, following the news on his computer screen. He felt no satisfaction, no relief, only typed a new line into the open document. Phase 2, trace the entire complaint handling system across federal zones. He didn't want to stop with just one man. What he needed was true movement, a full re-examination, not because of public pressure, but because the institution itself must finally be ignored. News of the arrest spread quickly. Major outlets covered it with a careful tone, but could not hide their surprise. Some articles began revisiting the history of dismissed complaints and cases handled internally with no clear outcome. People who had once stayed silent started to speak up, forwarding old emails, digging up correspondence, and reposting entries that had once been taken down. There were no street protests, no banners, but comments, short clips, and modest testimonials kept surfacing, as if every piece was finding its rightful place. For many, justice didn't come with a court verdict, but in the moment they first saw someone who had long stood above the law, pulled back down to where he had always believed himself untouchable. This time it was the system itself that signed the warrant, and the one who signed it wasn't pressured from outside, but from files long forgotten, now returning as a reminder that could no longer be ignored. The trial began in silence, but not the familiar kind that often blanketed proceedings for misconduct within the force. It was a silence of anticipation, not waiting for a defense, but for the first time to witness the legal system properly naming a type of unchallenged for far too long. The witness stand was placed at the center of the courtroom, directly facing the jury. No one had to conceal their identity. No one was asked to speak using codes or assigned numbers. The first to take the stand was a young woman, her eyes steady, though a faint scar remained visible on her wrist. She didn't tremble, didn't pause to search for words, but spoke as if every detail were still etched into her memory. She described the moment he approached her at the public basketball court, speaking in a tone that wasn't overtly threatening, but still chilled her. "No one believed me. They said he was just joking." Then she looked directly at the rows below, but I never forgot that look in his eyes. Next came the mother, who had been shoved at the airport. She walked slowly, her hand still marked by the injury from that day, but her voice was firm. She recalled what the officer had said while searching her youngest child. "Kids know how to hide knives better than adults." She paused for several seconds, as if giving the room time to absorb the absurdity of applying such suspicion to a little girl in a pink dress with a bow. "I'm not asking anyone to believe me, but since that day, my daughter hasn't slept soundly." An airport employee was called afterward, carrying logbooks from the shift during the incident. He confirmed seeing the woman pushed while holding her child. "I wanted to step in, but got a warning glare. I used to think staying silent was safest," the prosecutor asked. "And now?" He didn't hesitate. "Now, I understand silence is part of the wrongdoing." The final witness was the young man who recorded the first video. He held up his phone, and the short clip played on a large screen. In the courtroom, no one moved. The scene was familiar: the mother bending down for her child, being shoved, the youngest daughter crying, and the officer inspecting the bag of a child not yet out of elementary school. "I only meant to protect her," he said. "I didn't think it would change anything. But if everyone looks away, this will keep happening." After the witness testimonies, the prosecutor stepped forward, holding a small, light purple notebook. It was a copy of the journal belonging to the girl who had taken her life 3 years earlier, a case once closed due to insufficient evidence. He opened to the final page and read slowly, each word echoing through the microphone. "If he still wears a uniform, who will protect us?" In a room long considered the place where justice is upheld, that question wasn't just directed at the defendant. It was for everyone who had once chosen silence. The silence in that moment was no longer passive. It carried the weight of responsibility, settling on every shoulder. Some jurors looked down, hands clenched on their laps. The air was heavy, but necessary. For the first time, the investigation was not guided by rank or reputation, but by fragments of memory once thought forgotten. The presiding judge emphasized that this was not merely a trial of one individual. It was a hearing on the culture of cover-ups, on a system that enabled wrongdoing by refusing to listen, to believe, or to reopen files. And every testimony that day, from the young woman, the mother, the airport worker, and the man behind the camera, became undeniable proof that such a system had existed. But this time, their stories had been written down, recorded, shared, and brought into the light, no longer in a diary, but before justice itself. He threw his head back and laughed, the sound echoing through the wooden rows of the courtroom, making a few people frown, others turn away. "Justice," he sneered at each syllable, as if that word amused him the most. "You can't handle the truth. You like your happy endings. But the truth is, you always need a scapegoat to wash away collective guilt. Today it's me. Tomorrow, who's next?" He finished speaking, still laughing, as if the sentence ahead could never touch him. The prosecutor said nothing. The judge didn't interrupt. The sentence had been thoroughly deliberated. Before announcing it, the presiding judge spoke just one sentence. The defendant's actions were not only his own, they are the result of a long chain of silence, neglect, and protection. 10 years without the right to appeal is not a punishment, It is a necessary distance, forcing a person to face his own shadow. The gavel struck. 20 years in prison, with no possibility of sentence reduction during the first 10. No one in the courtroom cheered. There was no applause. No fists raised in victory. Instead, a deep silence settled, as if everyone inhaled at once and forgot to breathe out. A few sat motionless, eyes red. Others reached for the hand beside them, as if to confirm this was real. Perhaps everyone understood. This sentence, though necessary, was not an ending. The mother stood up, leading her children out of the courtroom. The youngest girl still clutched her mother's sleeve, but her eyes no longer held fear. She looked around, seeing for the first time strangers nod toward her family, without avoiding her gaze. In the hallway, a young woman, the one who had written the final line in the diary, was wrapped in her aunt's arms. She whispered, "I didn't know if I was strong enough to speak in court." Her aunt replied, "You didn't need to be strong. You only needed to be real." Malcolm walked slowly outside, his phone still buzzing with messages from colleagues at the Department of Justice. He didn't read them. He stood by the barrier, watching the crowd disperse into the square. One person held a small sign that read, "Not every victim survives to tell their story." Others simply stood in silence. Those who had once feared recording, once stayed silent, now held candles, slips of paper, or simply gazed longer than usual, all signs that something in them had changed. A few reporters followed, asking for comment. Malcolm said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The witnesses had spoken. The evidence had been shown. In every clip, every file, every trace the system once chose to overlook. He walked toward the parking lot, where his wife and children were waiting. His eldest daughter ran ahead and asked softly, "Are we safer now?" Malcolm bent down, brushed her hair back, and nodded gently. "Not completely, but at least now you know you can stand without bowing your head." She said nothing more, only held his hand tightly. Inside the courtroom, the officer was escorted out through the rear exit, his eyes still holding defiance. But this time, no one looked away. The guards stood firm, faces neutral, and with every footstep echoing down the hallway to detention, there were no more sounds of resistance. Only a long exhale from those who had once believed the system would never look back at itself. The case was closed. But the question of what permits someone to hurt others without being held accountable remains. And perhaps only when that question is asked in the quietest places, in classrooms, in late-night conversations, in closed-door meetings, can justice truly begin, not with a verdict, but with what happens after everyone leaves the court. The hearing took place in the third-floor conference room of the police department, a space that had once processed hundreds of internal decisions each year. But that day, no financial reports or administrative directives were discussed. The chairs were arranged in a crescent, facing a coordination table composed of representatives from the Department of the Interior, the Department of Justice, and an independent member from the Ethics Oversight Council. Names once casually referred to as teammates were now divided into categories: witnesses and those asked to explain. The first to step forward was an officer with 23 years of service, gray streaks in his hair, a weathered face. He stood, hands folded in front of him, voice low but clear. I knew there was a problem from the first weeks of patrol. Sometimes I saw him detain people just because of a glance or a handbag, but I didn't speak up. At the time, I was applying for a loan to expand my house. The bank required 6 consecutive months of stable pay, no transfers, and no negative marks. I needed this job. He paused for a few seconds, eyes stinging, though no tears fell. I haven't been able to forgive myself, but I also don't know if I had any other real choice back then. Next was a young female officer who had worked in the same unit. Voice trembling, but eyes steady. I filed reports detailing 3 separate violations, but my direct supervisor tore the report in front of me. He said, "You want to be reassigned to a border post?" I got the message. I kept the copies but never dared submit them to higher-ups. At the time, I thought at least I had the evidence, waiting for the right moment, but the truth is, I waited too long. Another officer spoke bluntly. I used to joke around with him. I used to think those people must have done something to deserve how they were treated. But after the girl took her life, I went back and read the files. The fault wasn't just his, it was the quiet consensus we had all agreed to. The entire room felt heavy. Some wrote notes, others stared down at the table, not lifting their heads. The head of the review panel asked, then why, after every complaint, was there still a stamp that said insufficient grounds for further investigation? No one answered immediately. One person finally spoke, exhausted. Because he had a shield, every report was blocked at the outer layer. Sometimes they never reached the decision-makers. Some who tried to send reports directly the next day were reassigned, subject to random checks marked for uncooperative behavior. From the back row, a records clerk quietly stood up. I was the one who entered data for 3 of the complaints. They were marked as low priority. I didn't ask why, I just followed the system codes. But now I understand. Every incorrect code entered was another fragment of someone's dignity, pushed down. By the end of the hearing, the Ethics Council representative read aloud a preliminary proposal to launch a 3-year review of old case files, reassess the entire reporting intake process, and restructure data access rights to prevent centralized control by a select group. The proposal also included temporarily suspending those who had directly blocked the complaints, not as punishment, but to maintain transparency during the expanded investigation. No one objected. No one clapped either. Each person left the meeting room in silence, as if they had just undergone a screening where no one was entirely exempt. Though the individual standing before the court was just one person, the system understood that what needed to be addressed was much larger and much more delayed than the verdict that had just been read. And now, the hardest part begins: to examine oneself. When that TSA officer stepped forward, the already heavy room became almost suffocating. A young woman, small in stature, clutching a trembling folder of documents, stood before dozens of eyes on the hearing panel. Her hair was neatly tied back, her face bare of makeup, but her voice had lost the composure of someone trained for emergencies. She spoke, slowly but clearly. That day, I was there. I saw the officer raise his hand. I saw the mother lose her balance and fall to the tiled floor. No one held me back. No one threatened me. I just turned away, because I thought that if I intervened, I would be seen as going against the coordinated force. I was afraid of being reassigned. I was afraid of being removed from the quarterly commendation list. Her voice broke when she mentioned the eyes of the crying little girl clutching her mother's dress. That look haunts me to this day. It wasn't hatred. It was like a silent question. Why didn't you help my mom? I bowed my head, slipped past the checkpoint, and walked quickly as if I had nothing to do with it. But I knew I had betrayed both my profession and my conscience. The panel did not question her. There was no need. Those seated behind her didn't scoff or blame either. They stayed silent, because that confession was not made to lessen guilt, but as a form of public reckoning. It was the first time since the incident that someone outside the police force acknowledged the fault of silence, and that statement, simple yet weighty as a verdict, echoed far beyond the hearing room. Within just 1 hour, the largest media outlets ran bold headlines: "Silence is not neutrality. It is choosing a side without speaking." The phrase spread like a wave, appearing on protest posters in several states, quoted in speeches at law schools, even handwritten on whiteboards in high school classrooms, as a reminder that silence, in the face of injustice, is not innocence. It is a choice, and that choice has consequences. Later that same day, a local news station aired an interview clip from a former member of the internal investigation team. That person stated, "Many saw the wrong, but they were used to bowing their heads, used to staying quiet, because they thought the system wouldn't change over a single testimony. But the biggest mistake is believing you're too small to make a difference." At airports across the country, TSA agents began requesting additional ethical behavior training, an initiative never seen before. They didn't wait for orders from above. Some shift supervisors contacted human rights groups to invite guest speakers, hoping that what happened at that security gate would never repeat, not because of public pressure, but because of an awakened conscience. In an eastern state, a group of public administration students printed the phrase, "Silence is choosing a side," on T-shirts to raise funds for the family of the deceased woman. The victim's father, who had once attempted suicide, said he didn't need the money, but upon receiving the shirt he replied, "If each person dares to stand for what's right just once, then my daughter's death won't be in vain." At the FBI office where Malcolm worked, the newspaper bearing that headline was pinned right next to the security bulletin board, not to honor anyone, but to remind those in duty that truth doesn't need to be loud to be heard. It needs someone to choose to stand with it from the very first chance. And sometimes, doing what's right doesn't start with the whistleblower, but with the one who refuses to look away. In a themed session at a public high school in the suburbs, a meeting room had been turned into a space for dialogue. Plastic chairs were arranged in a semicircle, with a small table in the center holding a faintly glowing projector screen. On the screen, a large question read, "Which reflex will save someone?" No graphic footage was shown. Instead, there were short video clips, quotes from news articles, and still frames, capturing the gaze of the mother at the airport, a look many students later described as like she was staring right at me, even through a photo. The civics teacher stood in the center of the room, holding no lesson plan, speaking not like a lecturer. She asked a question. Imagine you're there, witnessing someone being treated unfairly, but you're afraid to speak up because you might get involved. Which reflex would come first? A step back or a step forward? The question demanded no right or wrong answer, but suddenly the room fell unnaturally quiet, as if everyone had entered an internal dialogue of their own. A small framed girl in the front row, hair tied to one side, raised her hand. Her voice was steady and clear, yet carried a kind of sorrow that no 16-year-old should have to bear. "If I look away when my friend is insulted because of her skin or her appearance, would I still be trustworthy when I say I'm a good person?" The class turned toward her, not out of admiration for her courage, but because her question had stripped bare something everyone had felt but never said aloud. Kindness cannot come later. It cannot be an afterthought. The boy added, "I think people say, 'Let's wait and see,' as a way to delay things. But while they wait, someone gets hurt." The teacher didn't interrupt, just nodded and let the conversation continue. The atmosphere no longer resembled a typical homeroom session. It had become a place where students dared to question themselves about moments as seemingly small as looking away when someone is mocked in class, or laughing faintly when a peer is called by a cruel nickname. At the end, the screen displayed another line, "Silence is not peace. It's a mask for choosing sides." Some students quietly jotted it down in their notebooks. Others snapped a quick photo with their phones, not to post, but to keep. A history teacher, standing just outside the hallway, whispered, "If this generation is starting to ask itself these things, maybe an incident like what happened at the checkpoint won't have to repeat, at least not in silence." Later, a group of students proposed painting a mural behind the school, with no political symbols and no images of specific victims. They simply wanted to depict a familiar scene, a child turning away from a crowd mocking his friend and placing a hand on that friend's shoulder. No dialogue, no slogans, just action. Because, as one student put it, courage doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it just needs to show up. In another part of the city, a parent council, after hearing about the session, began discussing ways to integrate moral reflex training into early school curricula. One mother, a former flight attendant, shared, "I used to teach my child to be cautious, not to get involved in other people's issues. But after this, I think what I should be teaching is how to step in at the right time in the right way." The airport incident had moved beyond the realm of news. It had become a mirror through which communities, classrooms, and families reflected on themselves. Because truth doesn't always need to be shouted to make change. Sometimes it begins with a question that ends without an exclamation mark, but makes an entire generation pause to think. And from questions like that, a society begins to relearn how to stand beside what is right. The class ended, but no one left their seat right away. The students remained still, as if the teacher's final words were still hanging in the air. "You are not adults, but you have eyes, ears, and a choice. The sentence wasn't emphasized with a raised voice or a finger pointing at the board, yet it lingered more deeply than any proposition in the textbook. It didn't ask them to be heroes, only that they not shut down their ability to feel and to choose action, even if that action was merely to look more clearly for a little longer. Some teachers at the school began proposing that the case be turned into an official teaching module, not to exploit its shock value, but to help students understand that justice is not an abstract concept reserved for courts or officers. It is something visible in everyday moments, right in the schoolyard, when a student is left behind in a wave of mocking laughter. From that came the special lesson titled, "When Justice is Not Armor, but the One Who Stands Beside You." In the first session, teachers didn't tell the story chronologically. They began with a photo. 3 people, a mother, a child, and a man standing a few steps away. Their eyes weren't facing the camera, but seemed to be looking straight at the viewer. "What do you see?" the teacher asked. One student answered, "They're not avoiding attention, but they're not trying to draw it either." Another student added slowly, "They're standing there, like no one else is protecting them, so they have to stand like people who deserve to be seen." There's no grading rubric that can score those responses, but even the teacher admitted that was the moment they believed their teaching wasn't in vain. The students didn't need to know the victim's name, didn't need to read legal codes to understand what was right. They only needed to recognize, if just one more person had stepped forward that day, a young woman's life might not have ended in despair. In the school board meeting room, a board member shared her daughter's reaction after the lesson. She asked me, "Mom, have you ever turned away?" I wanted to say no immediately, but then I thought, maybe I have. That question led many adults to reflect on their reflexes. No longer was it, "I was scared," or "I didn't know what was happening." It became, "I chose silence, and that's made me rethink things." With that growing ripple effect, several other schools in the district began reaching out to borrow the lesson materials. Some worried that bringing sensitive topics into classrooms would stir controversy. But most parents agreed that it is precisely because society avoids them that we need classes that do not. A psychologist advising the program concluded, "This isn't education about an incident. It's education about the role of a witness, something ethics classes rarely touch." That lesson sparked a small change with wide resonance. During recess, a group of students stepped in when they saw a classmate being mocked for their skin color. They didn't shout or record it, just stood closer, placed a hand on their friend's shoulder, and asked the other student, "Do you realize what you just said could be hurtful?" Nothing escalated. But that day, the teacher received a message from the offended student's parent. "For the first time, my child told me their friends stood up for them before an adult had to step in." What began as a case seemingly closed with a verdict became a real shift when the children realized they were not powerless. The lesson on justice was no longer confined to adult concepts, but began where it often seems smallest, in a classroom, in a brave question, and in a choice not to look away. And maybe, if such lessons continue to be repeated, justice won't have to wait until someone falls for it to appear. The press conference at the City Hall auditorium attracted hundreds, including media representatives and local leaders. A state government spokesperson announced plans to erect a statue in the Central Plaza to honor Malcolm's family for their courage and unwavering fight against injustice. The applause echoed as a sketch was unveiled, depicting the father standing tall among a crowd, his hand gently resting on his wife's shoulder, eyes fixed on their daughter, carved with rough yet expressive lines. However, the atmosphere shifted when Malcolm's family arrived, choosing to remain at the back rather than step on stage. When reporters approached, the wife said quietly, "We didn't do anything great. We just didn't stay silent." Her words carried no drama or defiance, but made the room pause, reminding everyone that justice doesn't require statues, but daily acts by each person. Malcolm gave no public statement, quietly stepping away from the crowd, leaving words of gratitude unspoken. When a reporter asked if he regretted going public and turning his family into a symbol, he stopped and replied thoughtfully, "If something ordinary becomes a symbol, perhaps the issue lies with society." The next day, flags flew at half-staff to honor victims once been unheard, yet the statue plan was canceled. Instead, a scholarship fund named The First Voice was established to support students who took concrete steps against discrimination and systemic violence. At the inaugural ceremony, a young girl shared that she once feared exclusion for defending a friend mocked in public, but recent events showed her that speaking out did not cost friendships. It helped her find true ones. Initially, many adults thought the Malcolm family's response was extreme, but after reflecting on the wife's words that they sought no honor, only the peace to live with integrity, respect began to replace doubt. A veteran journalist wrote in a weekend editorial, "Some enter history through extraordinary deeds. Others leave an indelible mark through quiet integrity." At a law student forum, a question was posed. If the Malcolm family had stayed silent, would justice have followed? The answer came from a simple story. A student who was once forced to remove her jacket during a school bag search submitted a petition after seeing the airport video. Her petition did not mention race but contained one line, "I want to be searched as a human, not an object." Not long after, schools in the area issued new directives regulating student searches, mandating guardian or counselor presence during any suspicious check, and requiring signed documentation of all actions. The reforms bore no name, but everyone knew who had inspired them. Thus, the legacy left by the family was not a statue in a public square, but the growing reflection in each community member asking, "If I had been there, what would I have done?" These small questions grant justice life, not through spectacle, but through the quiet choices of ordinary people. Early one morning, before the airport's first travelers arrived, a small bronze plaque was quietly installed beside security gate number 4, the site of the incident that shook the nation. No official announcement was made. A worker in a safety vest placed the plaque, drilled lightly, hammered steadily, and wiped off the dust before walking away. The plaque's inscription glowed beneath fluorescent lights, carved deep enough to read clearly, "Don't ask who's right, ask who's brave enough not to stay silent." The spot had once been marked by images of a mother pushed down, a child turned away in fear, and countless indifferent stares. It was chosen not to remind people of past wrongs, but to challenge every passerby. Today, will you look closely or turn away again? Amid rushing travelers, some paused at the plaque, a few took photos, but most hurried on, reluctant to carry such weight, precisely the hesitation the plaque was meant to capture. The check-in counter that morning was quieter than usual. Malcolm's family stood in the priority line, carrying a few small backpacks, just enough luggage for a short trip. His eldest daughter wore her summer camp uniform, her smile a mix of excitement and nervousness. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation, but beneath that was something deeper, a visible sense of ease, as no one in the area looked at her family as something strange or out of place. Malcolm's wife noticed the shift in atmosphere. There were no suspicious stares from security personnel, no glances scanning their skin color or silence. Instead, there was polite professionalism, sometimes tinged with the awkwardness of people who knew exactly whom they were facing. A TSA officer asked the little girl if she needed help with her boarding pass, then stepped back when he saw she could manage it on her own. Everything moved smoothly, gently, the way it should have been all along. As they approached the final checkpoint, a middle-aged woman in a gray coat slowly walked over to Malcolm's wife. She gently placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice rough with emotion, and whispered, "You don't know this, but my daughter used to be so afraid of the police she couldn't sleep. After what happened, she finally sleeps in her room." The words were brief, but they carried an untold story. Malcolm's wife nodded, saying nothing, but her eyes conveyed full understanding. Malcolm stood nearby, observing it all, calm as always. He didn't interrupt or speak, simply watching the two women as if reading a chapter of a book he had written, but now told in someone else's voice. His daughter had walked a few steps ahead, turning back to smile at her parents with a face both innocent and wiser than her years. In that moment, he realized what they were protecting wasn't reputation, it was the ability for this child to grow up without fearing any uniform. The boarding call came through the speakers, cutting the conversation short. The woman walked away, leaving behind a small slip of paper in Malcolm's wife's hand, a hastily written note. "Thank you for not staying silent. My child now knows the right thing isn't always safe, but it can change a life." She held the note tightly, then carefully folded it and placed it in her bag. On the walk back to the parking garage, Malcolm didn't say much. He looked at his wife for a long moment, as if to affirm they had chosen the right direction, the right method, and the right moment. She returned a slight nod, not because she needed to, but because they both knew this return wasn't the end of a journey. It was the chance to witness a new generation stepping forward without bowing down. That day, the airport's automatic doors opened and closed countless times. People came and went, all busy, all with reasons to rush. But among them, a few quiet steps left prints at the very spot where an awakening had once begun. And in the ordinariness of a day spent sending a child off to summer camp, that family left behind something extraordinary, the memory of a fear dismantled, not by shouting, but by calm press. This story needed no special broadcast, no recording, no spokesperson, because every peaceful reunion after a crisis is the most powerful proof of real change. And sometimes simply returning to the place where shame once happened, standing firmer than before, is enough to remind others that if something wrong once occurred here, then right has begun to take root in the very same place. The girl stood beside her father, her eyes attentive, not just because of Malcolm's words, but because of the shift she could feel in the space around her. The baggage carousel kept turning. The intercom continued reminding passengers about their carry-ons, but to the child who had once seen her mother pushed down because of her skin color, every detail now carried weight. She understood clearly that what her father had just said wasn't a casual lesson, but the result of a journey they had walked together, and of others who had sacrificed their silence in exchange. A nearby passenger who had overheard Malcolm's words turned and gave a small nod. There was no compliment, no exaggerated expression, but the look held full recognition. That person, dressed in business attire and wearing an airline badge, quietly pulled a small notebook from her pocket, the kind used by ground staff for incident notes, and quickly wrote a few lines. She turned away, leaving the notebook on the information desk. Somewhere someone might read it. Malcolm's older daughter didn't ask any further questions, but her action was the best answer. Before reaching the security checkpoint, she turned back, took a folded piece of paper from her backpack, and wrote with a marker, "You have a right to be respected. Speak up when someone isn't." She placed the paper where people could see it, then walked away without looking back. It wasn't a random gesture. It was how she chose to answer the question she once asked her father, "What did we do wrong?" Inside the checkpoint, a young staff member picked up the paper and read it, looking around as if to find who had written it. No one claimed it, but that didn't matter. He folded the note, slipped it into his uniform pocket, as if to keep a personal reminder, unseen by others yet unforgettable. And from that moment, every instruction he gave, every glance, every gesture he used to guide passengers became just a little more thoughtful, not out of fear of being filmed, but because he had just learned that respect doesn't begin with policy, it begins with oneself. Malcolm watched his daughter pass through the checkpoint with a calm face, no longer tense. Her mother waved from a distance, then turned to him. "Our child has changed," she said, "but so has this place." He nodded, no words needed. Real change doesn't require banners. It shows through a glance, through the way a staff member steps half a pace back instead of blocking the way, through the way a passenger stands nearby without flinching, and sometimes through a small piece of paper. As they left the terminal, Malcolm paused for a moment at the digital board where flight information usually appeared. This time, among the lines listing departure times, One message was pinned in place. This terminal is committed to dignity and fairness. Every voice matters. He didn't know who had suggested that line. Maybe the new director, maybe an old staff member who had realized the value of presence. But he knew that sentence wasn't meant to honor anyone. It was meant to remind. Back at the car, his wife opened the door and took one last look at the airport grounds. Though it wasn't their first time there, it was the first time she walked away without a weight in her chest. Not because the pain was gone, but because she knew some things, if told at the right moment, would no longer be forgotten. And some things, if repeated the right way, would become a living lesson. Malcolm started the car, hands on the wheel, eyes still on the terminal shrinking behind them. Inside him there was no more rage, no more lone resolve. Only one thing remained, crystal clear. Justice, when preserved through small actions, will never erode. Even a whisper at an airport gate or a handwritten note can be enough to make the entire system pause and look more closely. And from that, perhaps one more person will choose not to turn away. At the state legislative hall, the usual routine was replaced by an unusual silence. A female legislator stood up, holding a draft bill titled Protecting Personal Dignity at Security Checkpoints. The opening clause was clear and firm. No one shall be subject to a body, baggage, or identity search without a clearly stated reason, accompanied by a written report filed at the moment of the request. Those who had once dodged responsibility had no choice but to nod in agreement, fully aware that continued silence would mark them as complicit in history. Once the bill passed, law enforcement agencies statewide received detailed instructions. Airports, train stations, and government offices began installing dual surveillance systems, ensuring all footage would be synchronized with a federal database and stored for at least 3 years. For the first time, oversight was two ways, from personnel to the public, and from the public back to the officer. This marked a significant, albeit overdue, shift in redefining the boundaries of authority. The law's special appendix listed 7 types of behaviors previously overlooked: threatening eye contact, unjustified body searches, unnecessary physical contact, offensive language, discriminatory demands for identification, domineering tone or posture during checks, and refusal to explain search reasons when asked. These acts, once seen as minor, were now formal violations, subject to discipline or criminal charges if repeated. In law enforcement training academies, a new slide proclaimed, "Power is not immunity." Curricula were urgently updated to include real-life case studies. In one reserve officer class, an instructor bypassed legal jargon to share a story about a child who developed anxiety after witnessing her mother's rough treatment during a checkpoint. The room fell completely silent, leaving no doubt about the law's necessity. At an internal Federal Transportation Security Agency meeting, the regional commander presented findings. 48% of cases required no in-depth investigation beyond video evidence. 12% led to immediate behavior correction. 3 officers faced suspension. 1 was prosecuted. Though silent, these numbers made everyone present reassess both past failures and future accountability. Meanwhile, outside the legislature, high school students staged a mock airport checkpoint for passers-by, distributing cards asking, "If you saw yourself on surveillance, would you feel proud or ashamed?" Sometimes societal change begins not with laws, but with a person's honest reflection on themselves. In a small house on the outskirts of the city, the police officer who appeared in the controversial video sat quietly before the Internal Affairs Review Board. No one forced him to speak, but he voluntarily took the microphone. "That day, I stood with my arms crossed. I didn't shout, didn't give orders, and didn't step in. I thought silence was the way to avoid trouble." His voice was hoarse, his hands resting lightly in front of him. "I grew up with the belief that loyalty meant keeping order, but now I understand that sometimes it's that false sense of order that kills what's right." The board did not respond immediately, but some eyes in the room softened, not out of forgiveness, but because something real had finally been said. In the rookie officer training class, the elderly instructor changed his lesson plan at the last minute. Instead of beginning with legal definitions or disciplinary protocols, he projected a still image from the video that had shocked the public. The image was paused at the moment the officer stood with folded arms as the mother was shoved to the ground in front of her daughter. "This," he pointed, "is not the most violent moment, but it's the one that breaks trust." A young cadet raised a hand and asked, what if he had spoken up that day? The instructor answered plainly, maybe we wouldn't need to rewrite the law. At a community forum in the Central District, residents gathered to share opinions on the new policies. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her voice clear. "I've never known the names of the people in that video, but I saw myself in it, because I once turned away when I saw a child unfairly yelled at the bus stop." Her words didn't bring tears, but they shifted the heavy atmosphere towards something more honest. Reactions that had long been taught as safe were now being reweighed on an ethical scale. At the same time, an arts high school held a special exhibit titled Silence and Boundaries. On the walls, dozens of drawings depicted everyday scenes. A child stopped because their backpack was too old, a father asked to prove his identity in front of his daughter, and an elderly woman held back because her wedding ring triggered the metal detector. Under each illustration, students wrote short captions. One 11th grader wrote, "We weren't born to be powerless witnesses. Teach us how to act before it's too late." In a live television program, when the host asked why the entire system was willing to change after what seemed like an isolated incident, a sociologist responded calmly, "No one in that case was famous. But that's what makes it matter, because when the system changes to protect those without names, that's when it truly belongs to everyone." That final sentence was repeated widely across social media, becoming a reflection of a quiet UT steady shift in a society relearning how to stand up for one another. One Saturday afternoon, sociology students recorded the 5th episode of their podcast, Silence is No Longer the Standard. There was no music or script, just honest talks with real people. The guest, a 75-year-old woman, recalled being stopped at a train station for carrying a cloth bag. She stayed silent then, thinking it was pointless. When asked why she spoke now, she said, "Because my grandchild shouldn't grow up believing silence is the only way to be safe." At first, the podcast's release drew little attention, but within days, clips spread widely, from student forums to activists' pages. Many thanked the show for reviving buried memories to heal rather than deepen pain. A history professor noted this was more than truth-telling. It was the start of healing untold stories. In a suburb, high school volunteers mapped forgotten places, collecting elders' stories of unjust checks and suspicious glances. Each dot on the map held a story like, "Here, my grandmother was told to remove her headscarf," or "Here, my father's car was searched on the way to school." These stories formed a hidden history of everyday injustice. A small publisher, recognizing the impact, proposed compiling the stories into a social record for libraries, schools, and police academies. Their goal was not sales, but to encourage listening over judgment. The idea spread through news and community talks as a reminder that paper can help break the habit of ignoring. At a state workshop, a woman shared how she was stopped at 16 and afraid to tell anyone. She spoke not for herself, but to warn that silence burdens the next generation. The room fell silent as everyone realized these words should have been heard long ago. The campaign reached beyond schools, inspiring short films that simply recorded people breaking their silence. Audiences stayed after screenings asking, "What have we been silent about?" Sometimes one question is enough to shift a community's awareness. An old video resurfaced showing a police officer standing before an Asian family at a baggage checkpoint. His tone was arrogant as he said, "This bag looks suspicious. Do your family members understand English?" The mother held her child. The father stayed calm. No argument or outburst, only heavy silence from those who knew they couldn't react. Back then, the clip was almost forgotten due to low public attention. This time was different. The airport incident made the officer the focus of scrutiny. past actions and vague remarks formed a distorted image of unchecked power. Social media users shared personal stories, no call to action needed. I was accused just for having the last name Tran. My husband was called an illegal immigrant, though born here. Thousands of stories flooded the comments, proving that collective pain was real. Teachers began discussing why people once defended such behavior. Students said many didn't see it as serious or feared trouble. The conversation moved beyond right and wrong, exposing long-ignored harm. A phrase spread online. Community response slow but not too late. A parent shared her pain over her child's experience with racial teasing and vowed to speak up now. Her words became a symbol that late awareness is better than none. A major paper argued speed does not define responsibility, noting society's obsession with viral reactions. Yet, justice sometimes comes quietly, from refusing false security. Research showed searches for citizen intervention rights nearly tripled in 6 weeks. Change isn't a movement, but growing awareness. Justice needs certainty, not speed, and when no one turns away anymore, the system begins to shift. In a senior civics class at a Virginia public high school, a new curriculum was introduced called the Checkpoint Story. When a family made the system unable to look away, the teacher wrote the incident date on the board and asked students to read excerpts from the convicted officer's trial. The room was quiet, not like usual debates, but filled with a sense that students were no longer bystanders. Students were split into groups to reenact parts of the story. Witnesses standing, the officer laughing in court, and the mother silently leaving the airport with a scrape, holding her child's hand without bowing. The dialogue was carefully chosen from case files, news, and diaries. No one was forced to use exact words. They chose them to keep the meaning intact. The play ended with no conclusion. The student playing the prosecutor faced the audience and asked, "If we all think we'll never be detained, who will be next in 10 years?" No one answered. Many fell silent, reflecting on themselves or those unfairly judged for appearance, voice, or name. The teacher thanked the class and said the goal wasn't to spark anger, but to build a reflex to pause when justice feels doubtful. He said, "The system only looks away when individuals choose to look away. That starts with the questions you just asked." A local paper covered the class, showing a photo of the makeshift stage with a chalkboard message. Justice doesn't happen by itself. It comes from uncompromising will. An 11th grader playing Malcolm said, "His calm wasn't natural. It was a choice not to fuel anger." Afterward, students asked to keep the script open for future classes to expand. The teacher called it the unfinished lesson, a reminder that justice is an ongoing journey of listening and standing up, not a finished act. At a statewide ethics conference, a teacher spoke about bringing justice into the classroom. When asked about the impact of reenacting a trial, he said, "Students don't need to be judges or lawyers to know where the limits are. They just need to know that standing up is never the wrong time, only if we've never tried." The quiet applause that followed marked a moment of awakening. At a faculty meeting, an ethics teacher shared, "We don't need to make them heroes. We just need to remember what happened." He spoke softly, without banners or music, yet his words struck those who had never taught students how to face their fears. He recalled a seminar where students were asked what had caused them to stay silent. They don't need us to speak for them. They need to know their memory remains and has a place. This inspired a local high school to create a silent room. It started with a group of students who had staged a courtroom play. They wanted a space where they could leave behind unspoken truths. An old classroom was transformed with circular seating and low whiteboards, so even younger students could write freely. On the wall, "Silent Room" was written in subtle italics, a reminder that you don't need to shout to be heard. A small mailbox allowed students to anonymously share their stories. Every week, the counseling team reads one of these stories aloud. One 10th grader shared, "I saw my friend teased for a torn shirt. I laughed to fit in. I wrote that down and put it in the box. When I heard it read aloud, I felt forgiven, but also knew I needed to change." Teachers noticed that the atmosphere had shifted to a quieter, more thoughtful one, as students began to ask what they could do when they saw others mistreated. The silent room wasn't publicized, but soon other schools asked how it worked. It became a model that spread through the area, its value lying in the words left unsaid. A veteran teacher recalled a ninth-grade student writing about being forbidden by her brother to wear an audai because of his fear of others misinterpreting her gender. "I wrote it down, and though I'm still scared, I know I've been seen." The principal later stated, "We didn't create a place for students to be brave. We created a place for them to see they're not alone when they learn how to be brave." The message spread beyond a slogan. Education begins not with tests, but with a place where truth can be spoken. What started as a lesson in ethics, a reenacted trial, and a family standing firm in silence grew into a story that lived on in quiet spaces where voices didn't need to be loud, just real. A little girl held her father's hand as they passed through the security checkpoint, her pink backpack swinging gently. The coordinating officer that day gave a subtle signal, inviting the father to accompany his daughter to make the process less stressful. A small decision, but unlike any before. The mother, wearing a green hijab, silently watched, not fumbling for documents as usual. She said nothing, but her eyes met the officers with a gratitude that anyone familiar with Malcolm's story would recognize. A silent thank you, as if the past had been corrected by a right action in the present. After completing the procedure, the mother nodded quietly and quickly headed to the boarding gate with her family. They didn't know the officer's name, nor did he need to know theirs. Yet that simple act, letting a father accompany his daughter and avoiding the system's scrutinizing gaze, made that day free of hurt. A flight attendant who had witnessed many tearful passengers noted the moment in her diary. "For the first time in years, I saw a family that looked like mine pass through without being stopped to explain why they live here." The story was shared on the airport's internal forum. A security system engineer who saw it proposed adding positive behavior feedback to regular meetings. He said, "We record every loss of control, so why not record moments when someone stays calm and kind?" The idea was approved. A small board was hung in the control room, updated weekly with cases where staff's right reactions preserved passengers' dignity. That week's entry read, "Day 18, morning shift. Checkpoint C3. An officer did not ask why the father accompanied the child, but asked how to make the girl feel safe. No names were displayed, no awards given, but the recognition carried its power. Security staff, used to being named only for mistakes, began realizing they could be mentioned for doing right, even if unseen on video or online. One staff member from that shift shared in a private group, "I remember the first time I saw an officer not ask a mother to remove her headscarf. I almost cried. Now I laugh because I see someone passing through normally." In the following days, nearby airports started discussing child screening procedures, especially for families of Middle Eastern, African, or South Asian descent. Small actions, non-suspicious looks, gentle gestures, presence of parents were added to the new staff training. An internal memo noted, "You don't have to erase every mistake to start anew. Just stop repeating them and keep the moments when you got it right." The family of the young girl left the airport, unaware that the mother's gentle smile marked a shift. No articles were written about them, and no interviews followed. But in the gaps of a system that once overlooked so much, their presence became a test of a new reflex, the gatekeeper's role not to judge, but to protect others' space. As Malcolm's story faded into textbooks, it quietly lived on, through an unspoken right action, a gesture that made children feel safe, and a grateful glance that needed no name. That remark came at the end of a shift when only a few people were left in the break room. The man, a security officer for over 10 years, once considered quitting due to feeling like a cog in an indifferent system. But when that family passed through, not questioned excessively or forced to prove themselves, he realized his role was to protect, not enforce. From that afternoon on, internal meetings began sharing instances of doing right, rather than only discussing violations. One instance involved an employee ensuring an elderly woman with an oxygen tank didn't stand too long at the checkpoint. No praise, but a handwritten note on the bulletin board read, "Sometimes protection needs no orders, just patience." Those who thought the system relied on fear began to see change. Small suggestions like adding seats for elderly passengers or adjusting announcement language to reduce intimidation were trialed. Though small, these actions proved to those who witnessed Malcolm's story that society was trying not to repeat past mistakes. At an aviation security workshop, a manager shared, "We thought we were hired to enforce, but now we understand we can choose how to enforce it." Her words left the room in genuine silence, a silence of true listening, something once missing. Outside the airport, the changes began to spread. A non-profit report showed a decrease in random checks of minority children in states with new laws. They concluded, not everyone knows the origin story, but new laws are changing how children feel about existing without suspicion. No headlines were written about this shift, no reporters waited in the lobby. But anyone who passed through felt something had changed. Simple gestures, a nod, a gentle glance, were now celebrated as actions worth preserving. That nod, once a mere courtesy, now symbolized society's new lesson: how not to look away when witnessing wrongdoing. A quiet nod, needing no praise, but enough to make someone decide to stay. From that moment on, a system once used to shielding each other began to realize that correcting mistakes is not weakness, but the courage needed to move forward without being held back by past wrong. An internal report, marked confidential, quickly spread within professional circles as an urgent warning. It identified 203 checks lacking clear justification, and 64 cases showing signs of discrimination based on race, name, or religious attire. These numbers were not just statistics, but an unspoken confession that the system had allowed reflexes to override reason and emotions to trump law. Those once proud to maintain security now faced a truth never taught. Sometimes they were the threat others had to guard against. At a high-level training conference, a leader addressed hundreds of colleagues with a solemn voice, admitting, "We taught power as a skill, but in doing so, we forgot that power is responsibility. Not everyone skilled is entitled to use it." What seemed a belated correction sparked a quiet but profound effect. Training centers began reviewing curricula. Guidelines were rewritten to include situational pause, once seen as slowing down procedures, now recognized as crucial to distinguishing reasonable action from abuse. Malcolm was invited to be the chief advisor on the ethical reform program. He carefully reviewed all materials and gave specific feedback, but declined official appearances. In his reply, he wrote simply, "I do not need to be named, just make sure they relearn." For him, his role was not to become a symbol, but to erase false honor that silenced many. No recognition was needed if the lessons failed to reach learners. An internal document titled Balancing Reflex and Awareness included a line many reread. If professional reflexes lack emotional control, justice becomes crippled, and this will come from those who believe they protect it. The document became the opening lesson for retraining classes, where those once confident in quick responses had to relearn to pause, ask more questions, or simply look deeper into others' eyes before acting. In a practical training session, an instructor posed a scenario. A tense black passenger approaches. You feel uneasy. You have the right to search, but before ordering it, write down one sentence, why you chose that person. Participants, used to swift and decisive commands, hesitate, holding their pens, not because they couldn't justify, but because, for the first time, they realized how thin the line was between professional instinct and unconscious bias. Since then, a new term appeared in guidance materials, ethical threshold. It is the moment when professionals are encouraged to slow down before issuing orders, verify legal grounds, and, most importantly, examine their conscience. It does not replace reflex, but prevents reflex from becoming an excuse for mistakes. In each evaluation, high marks went not just to those who did right, but to those who dared correct themselves upon sensing they might err. In the hallway of a Northeast police academy, a whiteboard usually used for weekly schedules bore a phrase written by a trainee after the final class. If I am the only one authorized to give orders, then I am the only one responsible for what happens next. No one erased it, though it was unofficial. It stood as a sign that somewhere in the system, relearning had begun. And this time the lesson came not from books, but from a past they refused to repeat. Malcolm's family walked through the security checkpoint calmly. There were no suspicious looks, no intrusive questions, no hands rifling through their private lives. The security staff maintained a professional distance, not out of fear, but because they had understood what the system had previously avoided. Respect doesn't come from identity, but from seeing each person as a human being, not a threat. No one realized that this family had once been at the center of a major confrontation, nor that the space they were walking through had once been an invisible line between unconscious reflex and controlled justice. The children with them no longer remembered the details of the old story, but memories don't need to be complete to be valuable. What they knew was that their parents had not run, had not stayed silent, and because of that they grew up in a world where no one tore open a purse in public, where skin color was no longer the reason someone was stopped in their tracks. It wasn't a grand victory nor a dramatic overthrow. It was a slow movement, just firm enough to make what was once overlooked no longer go unnoticed. Near the checkpoint, a small section of wall bore an inscription, not large or bright, but clear like a heavy breath. You don't have to shout to change a system. You just have to stand. The words didn't refer to anyone specifically. It didn't carry a name, time, or event. But anyone who passed by, if they slowed down to look, would understand it was an invitation. Stand up, not with anger, but with a presence that cannot be ignored. The system that once resisted questions about bias was now forced to face them, and change, though not perfect, had begun. In moments that seemed small, no statues were erected, no ceremonies or plaques of honor. What needed to remain wasn't who did what, but what was no longer considered normal. This story didn't need a hero. It only needed someone to stand still at the moment when everyone else was used to turning away. In a society where speed and safety are often used as excuses to simplify human rights, choosing not to look away, not to impose, but to stop and truly see, has become an act strong enough to force a whole system to rethink its operation. From this story, readers don't need to remember each character's name. What matters more is recognizing the recurring lesson in history. Justice doesn't appear on its own. It needs someone to see the misdirection before the consequences happen. It needs someone brave enough to speak when everything hasn't yet reached its breaking point. And most importantly, it needs repetition, not of mistakes, but of courage. One act of standing up may not be enough to change the law, but one act of not looking away could be the beginning of a world where people no longer fear doing what's right. For anyone who has read this far, the question is not who will you become, but where will you stand when something happens in front of you? You don't need a title, status, or recognition. You just need to stand. And if enough people choose the same, then the next time someone is held back, insulted, or harmed, it won't be something the system can carry out in the silence of the crowd. This story does not end with a perfect conclusion. It steps back, inviting you to fill in what comes next. Justice is never a final chapter. It is a series of daily choices between silence and speaking up, between turning away and standing firm. And sometimes it all begins with just one steady pause, enough to inspire others to follow. All they did was not turn away. If you have read this far, perhaps the only thing to remember is not their names, but the question for you. When wrong is seen, will you turn away or will you stand?